Ephesians 1:11. In him we have also received an inheritance because we were predestined according to the plan of the one who works out everything in agreement with the purpose of his will.
Before I get into Ephesians chapter 1, verse 11 this morning, I want to start by talking about Jacob and Esau. Normally when people say that name, these two twins from the book of Genesis, the first book of the Old Testament, they say it in that order, Jacob and Esau, which is interesting, kind of funny, because Esau was actually the firstborn, which is significant. Now in our Western world here in the U.S., or if you're tuning in maybe by some other place, I don't know, in the Western world, we think a lot about what's right and what's fairness. We think we deserve a lot. Now, that wasn't always the case, particularly in a Middle Eastern world, but also just in history in general, that wasn't always the case. And for a firstborn, someone like Esau, you would be born, and it would be known that you would get the bulk of an inheritance. You would receive better and greater inheritance when your parents died. So when these twins were born, Jacob actually means like the heel grabber. He came out holding the heel of Esau, and it was declared at his birth, the younger will bow down, will serve the older will bow down and serve the younger, rather. So Esau, despite being the older brother, he was told, it was ordained at his birth, that he was actually going to serve his brother Jacob, who was actually younger and shouldn't have been the one if we were talking about fairness and rights. So fast forward after their birth, in Genesis chapter 25, you have Esau was like a burly woodsman. He was also very hairy. That tells you his name means hairy. He was covered in red hair, apparently, and just a hairy guy. And he goes out hunting, and he comes back, and Jacob was a little bit more of a homebody. We can relate to that right now. And he's cooking a meal, and Esau is very hungry from hunting and being very impulsive as well. He decides he needs to eat right then. And Jacob, being shrewd, being an opportunist perhaps, deceives Esau into giving him his birthright, this position of blessing as the firstborn child. So Esau hesitates for a moment, but decides pretty quickly, I will give you my birthright for a cup of stew, or a bowl of stew. He trades in his birthright, this blessing, something very important and worth a lot of money, essentially for one hot meal. What would you do for one hot meal? How quickly would you be willing to give up something of great value? So with Esau, it's for a hot meal. He gives up his birthright. Now I start with that to lead us into Ephesians 1:11, because it tells us there. Now there's a strong link between the Old Testament and the New Testament all across the board, and one of my favorite things to do is show us how the Old and the New Testament serve as mirrors, both pointing us to Christ. So the Old Testament looks forward to Christ, the New Testament looks back at what Christ has done for us as believers, generally speaking in the Gospels, and some of it looks forward to what he will do. So here in 1:11, we're told that we have received an inheritance because we were predestined. We talked a little about predestination in one of our other videos walking through this book in this series, Sit, Walk, Stand. To be predestined is to be told what your future will hold, that God has a plan for each and every one of us. Now, again, it might confound our Western sensibilities to think of the idea that we would have our future laid out before us. We don't like that. We like to think we're individuals who can carve our own future, but God, being God, knows the beginning from the end. He is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. He doesn't just know the end. He is the end of all of our lives. We're aiming towards him. That is the purpose of our life and being. So Jacob and Esau, it was declared at their birth, Jacob, the younger, will actually rule over the older. He will inherit something that was meant for him. And so he being a deceiver, he tricks his brother, and he does it again later in his life as well. We get an inheritance not because we deserve it. It offends some of us to see that Jacob ended up getting this as someone who deceived his brother. But there's more going on in this text in the Old Testament. There's more going on in our lives as Christians. We don't deserve an inheritance. We don't deserve anything from God. We deserve his wrath because we've sinned against him. We've rebelled against him. But like Jacob, because of Christ, there's this this thing that some have called it the Great Exchange, some theologians of the past, where Jesus gives us his righteousness and he takes the wrath we deserve. They call it the Great Exchange. You can see that in 2 Corinthians 5:21, says that he who knew no sin became sin, so that in him we might inherit the righteousness of God. So we get this inheritance that we don't deserve. And it's because God predestined us for it. He chose us according to his plan. He's the one that works out everything in agreement with the purpose of his will. I don't know how timely, these messages will be up on the internet and there for who knows how long. It's not always my favorite thing to talk about current events, but and it's hard to believe. I never want to put the Band-Aid of Romans 8:28, which is he works all things for the good of those who believe in him. Even bad things. I don't want to use that as a Band-Aid where, you're going through a hard time. Well, don't worry. God's using that for your good. But with this coronavirus situation, he works out everything in agreement with the purpose of his will. So there's a reason God is allowing this to happen. It's not contrary to his will. It will work out in agreement with the purpose of his will. God works out everything. He has a plan for each and every one of us. Do you trust that? Do you know that? Where do you struggle to believe that? How can you get help to overcome those struggles, to be content, to have joy in God, to be satisfied in what he's done for you, that he has a great inheritance for you, that you will someday be a co-heir with Christ, the firstborn, the first resurrected from the dead. Amazing news. Meditate on that, dwell on that today.